it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleagues, Marc Tarpenning, a venture partner at Spero Ventures, and Jonathan Kroll, an investor at Spero Ventures. The topic of today's AMA, Ask Me Anything, is sustainability, which is one of our core areas within our well-being prong. So I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions, and audience, please get your questions into the Zoom chat and we'll turn to you shortly. So Marc, I want to start with you by asking, how do you define sustainability? For some people, this is climate tech. For others, it's clean tech, but I think you see it more broadly. So walk us through how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sarah. It's fun to be here. Yeah, so sustainability is actually quite broad. I mean, fundamentally, it's about satisfying all of our material and nutritional wants and desires and needs in a way that doesn't, prohibit future generations from doing the same thing. And Stuart Brand, he's the founder of the Long Now Foundation that does a lot of work on sort of deep thinking and deep time and sort of long-term planning and thinking. He has an interesting take on it in that societies that survive in the long term are societies that don't limit their options in the future, because we never know what kind of weird crisis we're going to be in. And the more optionality we have, even as an individual or as a society in the future, increases our chances of thriving in that future. And sustainability is about making sure that future generations, our children and even perhaps us in old age, have that future optionality. It doesn't get compromised because of things we're doing now. And so it is a broad area, but it actually really, in the long term, if you will, has a really profound impact on the planet.
Hmm. Thank you, Marc. I like that framing, and so aligned to our sort of core values as a fund as well. You recently wrote about, and we all sort of recently worked on a deep dive into the sustainability landscape. Walk us through the thesis, and specifically, what kinds of products or services do you believe have the greatest potential to create both commercial success and, in so doing, environmental and human benefits at scale?
Right. So the thesis that Sarah's referring to, we look at all of our themes, really deeply every once in a while, and sort of do a deep dive and try to understand what trends are going on and where we should be investing. And in sustainability, there's several things that we look for. And one of them are companies that are making products, and I had a recent blog post about this, that are compelling for some reason other than just being sustainably produced. If you're only selling to the people who really, really care about reducing their environmental footprint on the planet, that's a very small part of the market. And you might have a fine business doing that, but it probably doesn't scale like a venture company or a venture investment needs to, in the sense that it probably doesn't get very, very big. But also it's likely to not have a very big impact. So we really look for companies that have products that are environmentally beneficial in some way, but also are desirable, more desirable than the existing product. It might be cheaper, it might be, faster, it might be nicer looking. There has to be something other than just its environmental impact is less. And because those are the ones that are going to become sort of massively produced, that are going to really take off and create, value. And I'm going to actually, switch for just a second. I have to grab something here. So today, Arvind Gupta, who is the founder of IndieBio, he joined Mayfield to help their sustainability practice. And there was a quote in the press today that I saw this, I said, I have to somehow work this in. He says, the next $1 trillion companies come from the entire world voting that there's a better way to consume everything that they're used to consuming, but it happens to be in a sustainable way. And I think that's the kind of company that we are looking for as well. That these are ones that have a great product that also are sustainable.
Thank you, Mark. And for anyone that attended Mark's talk on Monday, I'm sure you'll remember those great photos of the three-legged cars that preceded the Tesla Roadster, and can understand what he's talking about there. Tesla's a great example of this. I want to jump to Jonathan to walk us through a couple of other companies that you guys have seen that have approached this particularly well.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so, Tesla is the best example of this in the world. I mean, just to kind of recap Mark's talk from the other day, if you didn't get to see it, I mean, what's so amazing about Tesla is you see this just, this car company, but it's really wasn't started as a car company. The car was just a way to kind of solve a problem within sustainability, within climate, which is to wean off of fossil fuels. And the way to do that, then now harking back to our sustainability thesis that Mark was just talking about, is not to just create an electric car. That was not enough. You had to create a sexy sports car, and that was really the brilliance in Tesla. And that's why one of the reasons we believe that this model is a model of not just relying on sustainability itself, but having some other benefit beyond sustainability. It's really the way to win. So I can give you a couple other examples. Our most recent sustainability investment is in a company called Clarity. Clarity makes these very high quality but super cheap air quality sensors, and there's a whole bunch of cloud software behind this. So Clarity does a really great job of putting these cheap self-sustaining sensors all over the place, and so you get highly localized readings that are near real time about air quality. Now, the benefit beyond sustainability is that these things are about $249,000 cheaper than the alternative, which are these big reference stations, of which there was only a handful in the Bay Area. I think there were 7 around the Bay Area, which is an area between 7-8 million people. So now there's 200 of these Clarity sensors everywhere. So that's what we saw in that. I think, to pick another example, actually, I'm going to pick an example, and I'm going to kind of spotlight Jeff Anderson in the audience a little bit from Full Cycle Bioplastics, because I think is another great example of a sustainable company in the way that we view the world of sustainability, in that they make basically these bioplastics from any kind of organic inputs, so food waste, things like that. But what's beyond sustainability is you have a way to monetize either what is just typically trash for some folks, or you have a way to make something that's cheaper. So that's another, it seems subtle, but it's actually a big difference. So we always look for something that has a benefit beyond sustainability.
I want to just riff on that a little bit as well. So in sustainability, there's this thing of being able to continue on, forever, and keeping optionality for future generations. There are a couple of things in sustainability that aren't pure sustainability, if you will, but their external costs are so high that they actually limit what the future societies can do. So an example of that is climate change, obviously. We could burn a lot of hydrocarbons. We can find a lot of hydrocarbons. We can burn them forever. Not forever, but for, maybe 400 or 500 more years. But if we did that, all the land in the world would be gone, pretty much. We'd all be flooded and living on boats. I mean, it would be, that sort of Kevin Costner water world. And we really don't want to go there. And another example happens to be in plastics, where if we only used hydrocarbons to make cheap plastic, we could do that for a super, super long time. It's, pretty energy efficient. It's, the only problem is those plastics never go away. The whole world would be completely buried in plastic. So those external costs are so high that that's also part of sustainability in our thesis.
Thank you, Mark and Jonathan. Those are great examples. You've actually covered a bunch of territory. I mean, energy, recycling, air quality monitoring. This is a huge space. Mark, talk us through a couple of specific problems that you are keen to back solutions for.
Yeah. So clearly in plastics, let's just say, this idea of using permanent plastics that really never biodegrade. They get broken up into microplastics, and then we end up eating them over and over again, with bad effect. to use a single-use, single-use food wrapping is insane. Like no rational society would do that. And so that's an example of something that would be keen. There are issues around anything dealing with efficiency is also interesting to us. Using resources more effectively. Anything that also includes solutions where you can go back to virgin. So whether it's a kind of recycling that goes back to virgin. Aluminum is a great example of that. An aluminum can starts off as an aluminum can. Well, it starts off as bauxite, but anyway, it eventually becomes an aluminum can. And then it can go right back to being an aluminum can over and over and over again. Most recycling that we do is not like that. Most recycling is really downcycling, and it eventually becomes, sort of Trex bricks, or whatever that or decking, but it doesn't become back to what it was before. It gets worse and worse and worse over time. So we do look for solutions that whether it's in fabrics or plastics or anything else that can come back to virgin. This idea of what's called a full cycle, economy. Is I think super exciting, because that's where we're all going to, everything is going to eventually, move that way, and we do have these examples where it works. I mean, aluminum, for a variety of reasons, is relatively easy, but we're nearly there now with aluminum.
Thanks, Mark. That is a very cool set of opportunities in there. Last question from me, and then I want to turn it over to the audience. So if you haven't yet dropped your question into the Zoom chat, do so now or in the next couple of minutes, and we'll call on you soon. Last question is for Jonathan. As investors, sustainability is both a very hot topic and in some cases, not exactly where Silicon Valley has spent all of its time over the last decade and had a couple of burnouts. So walk us through, do you expect to see the same level of revenue and growth benchmarks with sustainability companies relative to other kind of more traditional software hardware companies?
Yeah, and this is a great question. And the short answer is, quite frankly, yes. And I think this is a good thing. I think it's a mistake to relax the sort of benchmarks around company building just because it's a sustainable company. And that's because, for us as investors, we don't have a separate sustainability fund. Every dollar we invest competes with the dollars that can just go to some SaaS company or something like that. So what this does in effect is raises the bar for entrepreneurs to build companies that, have a large sustainability component, but also are just as able to find product market fit and basically strike a deposit of huge demand in the ground and then, strike gold essentially. That's a good thing. I mean, I don't think we want to encourage folks to found companies and hit a set of benchmarks which are less than those that we would expect from all companies. And what they say, it's you shoot for the stars, it gets the moon. I think the moon here is in sustainability is fantastic, and that's in Mark's case, actually, I'm sure you were shooting for the stars and you thought you were hitting the moon, but who knew you would actually literally be shooting for Mars. And there's a Tesla Roadster on its way to Mars right now, and that'd just be this that's kind of a metaphor, but it's in reality this huge success, likely far beyond anything you could have imagined. And so that's what we want to encourage. I think the other thing, though, the more nuanced answer is that we see different business models and different sorts of form factors in sustainability than you do in other areas. So the pure SaaS model is not the typical model in sustainability. Almost always there's a hardware component. And so we'll see a lot of like we like to say, hardware enabled software in sustainability, or it'll be a process or some other sort of IP, whereas other realms that VCs typically deal in, it's purely digital. So in terms of growth, I think that's we take that into account. It's not realistic to expect a company that is building a hardware product or building a car or has a process to grow at SaaS rates, where it's just you just basically get to negligible marginal cost with each new user, right? You have incredible economies of scale. It's much harder to unlock when you have a hardware product. So those are all things we do take into account to give a more nuanced answer, but we encourage founders really shoot for the stars.
Well, and I want to add to that is that, you know, we are talking about the remaking ultimately of nearly the entire economy. I mean, there could hardly be a bigger opportunity. I mean, it's literally everything from food to energy, you know, to the clothes that we were wearing. Everything has to get remade in this next 50 years. So that is going to have a tremendous economic potential. And there really will be, you know, trillion-dollar companies that come out of this.
I love that macro perspective, Mark and Jonathan. That's super helpful. We're gonna turn over to the audience now. Our first question comes from James Sowers, and I think this is very specifically directed at Mark. So, James, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, great. Thanks for taking my question, and thanks for the great event. So my question is, are hydrogen fuel cells all hype, or is there a real potential for eliminating emissions with hydrogen as a clean energy source in any way?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So hydrogen fuel cells have probably a place. They're not for cars, and there's a whole variety of reasons for cars. They're not good for cars. One thing you always have to think about is where you get the hydrogen. So, you know, at the moment, you know, we don't have hydrogen mines. We don't get it. It's all bound up in everything around us. It takes energy to make the hydrogen. Now, sometimes there's been a lot of work being done in making green hydrogen. That's hydrogen as a byproduct of something else that we're doing. And you could imagine using that hydrogen that we make doing other things in innovative ways, instead of just releasing it or whatever, but actually, you know, burning it or converting it into electricity or heat or whatever it is that you're trying to do. I think that there's a lot of potential there. As an energy source, though, it isn't. It's an energy carrier, really. It's like a kind of bizarre battery, because, you know, we have to pour energy in to get the hydrogen free. You know, because the hydrogen's all bound up in everything. It's H2O, right? It's bound up in the water. And the only way you can break it free is to pour energy in, whether that's solar energy using, you know, some kind of fancy plant-like material, that, you know, which there's a whole process around that, or whether it's just pure electricity. We've all done that as a kid, you know, where you put it in the water and you crack it that way. But you got to pour energy in, and then you have to convert that hydrogen back into something that's useful. And that energy conversion process is super expensive with hydrogen. So, you know, are there places where it makes sense? Yes. Is it somehow a magic solution? It really isn't, because it really is just an energy carrier. But it might be useful as an energy carrier for certain applications, but for a lot of them, I don't think it really is.
Thanks.
Thanks for that one, James. Our next question comes from Scott Saslow.
Hello. Hey, Mark. I have a question for you. It seems from where I sit, I see a lot of capital flowing in the public markets, pardon me, towards sustainable strategies, you know, sustainable investing, ESG investing platforms and whatnot. But when I think about the activity in the private markets and specifically in venture capital, you know, certainly there's a handful of prominent impact funds. There's a bunch of other funds that are kind of sustainable in their approach, you know, you folks, the Obvious Ventures, the world, and so forth. But I feel like that's a much smaller percentage. I'm curious if you folks see it that way, and if so, why? And what can those that are you know, of the belief in pursuing these sustainable type investments and ecosystem, what can we do to kind of catch up if in any way we're behind the public markets?
It's an interesting question. I would say that there is a renewed interest in the venture community around investments, you know, in sustainability. So one thing is that there was, of course, obviously the first clean tech, you know, boom and bust that happened, and that was really, you know, a lot of investors got burned on that. And that was largely around energy competing with oil at $140 a barrel, basically. I mean, and once the oil, you know, changed its price, a lot of those investments stopped making sense. This new generation of sustainable investing, I think, is a lot more nuanced and a lot more clever. You know, whether it's the money that goes into, the Beyond Burgers or the Impossible Foods, that's a very different kind of investment, and they all got VC money along the way. And then you have major funds, I think, looking at even, as you say, the ESG goals for the big companies, but I think that is filtering down to even the startups. I don't like the term really impact funds, because impact funds, they're measuring something other than just economic performance as well. And I'm not sure that we really need that. If you say the company doesn't have to be that successful as long as it's, reducing, greenhouse, I think actually you really want hugely successful companies. We want to not be in this sort of impacty world. So, I mean, I do think there is something, but, there's a lot of money, out there for startups that are looking to make a difference in sustainability. So I'm not. It's getting better. I think the community was a little shocked after the clean tech thing, and it takes a while for it to sort of come back. But I think we're getting there, and the importance of it is becoming really clear, and the size of the opportunity, I think, is really getting clear. Whether it's the Amazon, or Bill Gates initiatives, all the way down to angel investing on Sand Hill Road has 2 or 3 different special interest groups now in sustainability.
One thing I would just add to that too is one of the problems in holding that back, which is hopefully changing, is under ESG you have the larger corporates, which often will take ESG initiatives just kind of under the auspices of greenwashing. It's really just as a marketing ploy, and that hurts this world, because what that means is there's not actually real genuine dollars behind the messaging from like a Fortune 500 corporate that's saying, we have these, such and such sustainability initiatives. It just means it's more for marketing purposes. So once those marketing metrics are met, the dollars fall off, and that means it's been harder for investors to put dollars behind companies because those messages are not genuine. So the less of that there is, the more growth there can be on the startup side.
Thanks for that one, Scott, and thanks, Mark and Jonathan, for those thoughtful replies. Our next question comes from Steve Favis.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello? Okay, great. Yeah, this is an incredibly engaging conference, by the way, Spero team. This is having a great time with this. The next question I have is regarding agricultural robotics. Part of my reason for motivation for making the system is the robotic system I'm making is for sustainability in agriculture. It's incredibly hard work, and as you know, if you're from the Sacramento area, the valley fever is really an issue. A lot of healthcare problems. It's just incredibly hard work. Are you bullish about agricultural robotics in the future?
Oh yeah, we have an investment in agricultural robotics. In fact, with Tortuga, and I, the mechanization of agriculture has been an amazing success story from, essentially the early 1900s until now. It used to be thought that only about half the population could ever not be in agriculture because, you can only produce so much food per person. You need half the population farming. And now we're down to, like less than 1%. But the jobs that remain are terrible jobs in the sense that they're very difficult to do. They have, they're hazardous frequently, whether it's with pesticides or with the valley fever, which is a particular thing in the Central Valley. I think it might be some other places too. And those jobs we really want to also replace, but we couldn't do it with regular mechanization. It really took advances in AI and in robotics in order to do that. So yeah, I'm extremely bullish. I think that the future is all about, having the jobs that people do be really meaningful and exciting, and really sort of nobody wants to end up, spending 12 hours a day picking stuff in a field.
Thanks, Mark. Next question comes from Jeff Anderson.
Hey, question for Mark and Jonathan. When you're looking at sustainability investments, how do you weigh regulatory tailwind and subsidy, which can be a little bit flippant and from time to time and really requires a lot of movement building when making those decisions?
I'll kick this off and then I'll kick it over to Mark. That's a great question. I think this is actually something our view about is evolving over time. So initially, I'll tell you where we started initially, which was that we thought it was not enough just to have regulatory tailwinds pushing a company or being the only thing a company can be writing in terms of demand. That's because on the other side of that, you're only incentivized to buy the minimum amount of whatever it is to check that box so you're in compliance. That's not really, that's shaky ground for a company. I think what we do see is that the best companies, have some other source of demand that's outside of a regulatory sort of environment, but also, could have a regulatory tailwinds as well. We see this with our portfolio company Clarity. They sell to oil and gas, which is not regulatory, but they also do serve the regulatory markets in terms of local governments. I'll give it over to Mark.
Yeah, I think that's, what we want to see real customer love for the product and demand for the product that isn't at the capriciousness of a particular administration, or a law. Now, that said, if there's a regulatory, tailwind really that helps accelerate the adoption, that is great. We'd really like to see the business plan not depend on that, though. We want the business plan to say, this is going to be successful for XYZ. Oh, and by the way, it's incredibly likely that future regulation is going to simply make our product more desirable and more, advantageous to have.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for that one, Jeff. We have just a few minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions if we can. The first comes from David Manis Salvis.
Yeah, thank you.
Mispronounced that one.
No worries. So I'm David. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Immutable, and we are developing a hardware software component that is geared for the trucking industry to save fuel. And one of the questions I have been struggling with is, for a company that's kind of building this sustainability aspect, and it's also geared towards saving fuel and decreasing CO2, what are the key parameters that you think we should be focusing on tracking, especially in a pre-seed, seed stage type of company?
Well, your product, I assume, is going to have an economic benefit for your customers. That's, when you're selling to the trucking industry, I'm guessing that it's largely about reducing their costs, and improving their, profitability. Yeah. And the great thing about that is that's exactly the kind of thing that's good, because, those companies can be more efficient, they can be more successful. Oh, and by the way, they're also reducing their carbon footprint. And that's exactly those kinds of things. In terms of what metrics, it's all of the same, as any company, it's what's the ROI, what's, how are you going to market it? How are you going to get, people to adopt it? How much are they really saving when they do it? It's all this standard stuff. You do have a great story to tell, though, because you can also tell those companies, by the way, not only are we going to save you money, but you're going to be able to say, and we've reduced our CO2 emissions, by 15% or whatever it is. So I think it's both it's not a gimmick, it's actually for real. And you're moving the needle forward, but you're doing it in this way of your product. It reduces, the cost of their operations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Our last question, and I think it's a 2-parter. So this one comes from Alyssa. Alyssa, can you unmute?
Great. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I just saw that I'm unmuted, but my video is off. Thank you so much. This is really awesome. So actually, I think my second question was just answered, so let's just stick to the first. We are in hiring mode right now. We actually connected with you guys back in March, but are now hitting the ground running. And we are evaluating a chief scientist candidate to head up our R&D team. And I hope this is applicable for some other people on this call as well. We're evaluating somebody with, industry veteran, many years of experience, versus kind of a freshly minted PhD. My question is, if you have any advice on, considering these two candidate profiles, and also any advice on if we select to make the more seasoned person more of an advisor, and then bringing on the kind of freshly minted individual as our chief scientist. I hope that wasn't too specific for everyone else on the call as well.
Mark, you probably had some experience here.
Yeah, and Jonathan, I'm going to let you chime in here too, because that's a complicated one. So it all depends on the people. So I'll just give an example. At Tesla, we had to make, we ended up having to make our own motors. And in that, we had a young guy who was fresh out of university, with a background in mechanical engineering and magnetics or something, and he was that was great. We also ended up connecting with a extremely senior, essentially retired motor designer, and they had very different perspectives, but were very useful, very good together, because both of them were quite innovative, in their own ways. There is definitely, an advantage to having experience, but like we did not take a lot of people from the car industry, for example, because almost all of their experience wasn't relevant to us. The car industry is a lot about internal combustion engines, and they have a way and a mindset of how to operate. And so we took very few people from the car industry. We took a lot more people from the manufacturing and consumer electronics industry. So it's very specific. It's case specific. And Jonathan, I'm going to let you jump in too, because you've had more recent hiring experience.
Yeah, no, it's just a really good question. Without knowing the specifics, it's very hard to give you a discrete answer here. But I would say the one dimension I would also evaluate that's sometimes not considered is, like, are you talking about somebody who's super experienced but has only worked in large companies with layers of bureaucracy or management, versus somebody who has like less experience but still is a fit but has worked in a number of startups? And the reason that's important is because you being a startup, it's going to be a different world and a complete culture shock, and basically like jumping into like the ice-filled bathtub for the person who has never worked in a startup. And that is basically 50-50. It might even be like 60-40 for it not working out versus working out. The odds could be even worse. So there's that extra risk there that I would just suggest evaluating between the two. All things being equal between the two, then it's really more of evaluating the trade-offs in terms of the the difference in cost and where you are financially. But there's also an element of hunger and like fire in the belly. And sometimes the more successful you are, this is not always the pattern, but like sometimes they can be inversely correlated, right? The more successful you are, the less you need or want. And then, the kind of the less drive you have to achieve in that sense, whereas in the startup, that's incredibly important because you're trying to basically pull off the impossible, or you should be in your company. So I hope that's helpful.
It was. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I hope it was helpful for some of the other folks on the call as well.